Sorry, folks, we'll get started in just 1 minute. As you all know, I'm also coordinating the other two rooms, so I'm just making sure that they're up and running, and then I will be right back and we'll dig into this. We've got a lot of content to get through, so thanks for your patience. I'll be right back. Thanks everyone for your patience. I did just have to get the other sessions up and running, but they are up and going now. So hopefully they can survive. This is the one session I'm sort of delivering solo today. I'm going to sort of ask everyone, if you don't mind, it really helps me out if you can put your video up. I'm going to actually jump into a second room here in the hopes that I can really see faces and interact and engage with you that way. It just makes it a lot easier for me to present if I can sort of see that you're all in the room and that you're hearing me. There we go. Make sure I don't join the audio. Perfect. Now I can see some faces. That's very helpful. Excellent. So the intention of today's session is to deal with equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'm going to talk a lot about a lot of the different movements that have been occurring, and I'm going to really share some data about the national survey we've just done on inclusion. Just make triple sure that I'm actually talking unmuted. I am. All right, so here we go. I have like 3 computers going. Will help me if I can. There we go. So we're going to do a quick acknowledgement. We're going to set some ground rules. We're going to talk about how we got here. I'm going to share some survey data with you, and then we're going to talk about where we go from there. So if you take just one moment, I always start any speaking engagement with an acknowledgement. It's part of my commitment to the Indigenous reconciliation process. So I'm going to ask you to sit with both your feet on the ground in a neutral position, focusing entirely on the acknowledgement for just 1 sec. I'm sure lots of you are multitasking, but to begin with, I just want to acknowledge that the ALA offices are in Treaty 6 territory, the traditional meeting ground of many, many Indigenous people for many thousands of years. And I personally am always very grateful for that community's willingness to train me and teach me. I've had opportunity to work with Dr. Rich Croshu a lot this year, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity to share their culture and to do better. And a theme for me today is about doing better and not being afraid to make mistakes. As long as we're coming from a good place, communities of color and Indigenous people will work with us. And that's a big message for today. So I just want to acknowledge that. And some of you are in BC, some of you are in Ontario. So we're all treaty people. Except for those of us in BC where it's the unceded land, and that's a different conversation. And it's a much tougher conversation, but I just want to acknowledge that. I have too many keyboards. Try this again. There we go. Okay, so for today's communication, we're going to use the respectful communication guidelines. The intention is that we will take responsibility for what we say without blaming. We're going to use empathetic listening. We're going to be sensitive to differences in style. I want you to think about what you hear and feel before you speak. I challenge everyone to examine assumptions. Anything we talk about today is actually being recorded, so less confidential, just for the record. So do keep that in mind. If anything does come up that becomes a matter of confidentiality, we will not share the recording, but I think we can probably stay within those bounds. And ultimately, I'm asking you all to sort of trust and join me on this journey to really understand some of these topics. And we will have some discussion towards the end. So how did we get here? Obviously, a big part of these conversations is acknowledging Canada's colonial history. We, especially with the Black Lives Matter movement, there's this belief that we were the end of the Underground Railroad and we did no wrong. Truth is, we had various forms of slavery in this country up into the late 1700s, I believe, 1800s. We also have a long history of oppressing our Indigenous community. So we are certainly not, in a lot of ways, we're not in the same context as the American context for Black Lives Matter, especially, but we have our own issues. So nobody should assume that we're somehow better or different. That led us in the last few years through CSLA and ALA to look at reconciliation as part of the truth and reconciliation process. And there's been lots of conversations in that area across the country. Our process here has been a little slower, largely because we don't seem to have that base of people that have a strong connection. And so we're having to do a lot more front-end learning. And we've committed a lot of resources. I've spent a lot of time in training sessions with Indigenous partners. And ARPA, Alberta Rec and Parks, has been a huge partner for us in that regard. And I really encourage you to look at their content because it's excellent. And that led us into the Black Lives Matter movement this past summer. And as we all know, that has its own context that originally was couched in the US, but certainly is a big part of Canadian culture. And there's been a lot of Canadian content related to that. And so keep that in mind, that that's what sort of really pushed this Black Lives Matter and BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous People of Color, conversation forward. And it came from a letter that was received by a lot of the members and students and interns that went primarily to CSLA and OALA. But in Alberta, because I had lived through Edmonton's Pride conversation with the Black Lives Matter community, I was pretty prepared for the fact that this couldn't be ignored and it couldn't wait. So we jumped ahead and tried to get on top of this and tried to provide some leadership, not only provincially, but nationally in industry. And that led to those national collaborations. So I meet with BC, Ontario, Manitoba, and national. We meet about every 2 weeks. We were doing it every week at the height of COVID. Now we're about every 2 weeks. And we're working continuously together to address these and other issues that have a national conversation to them. And so that's what led us to the national survey, which I think unofficially closed on Friday, but we'll continue to collect data until we feel comfortable that we've got as much as we can. And I'm gonna take you through that data. We do have an Alberta subset, but it takes a lot of crunching. I got the data set about 8 o'clock last night. So anything you see in this presentation happened between 8 and about 9:30 last night. And I might possibly have been having a libation at that time. So hopefully most of the typos have been addressed. Any of you who've seen my presentations in past know that typos are part of the deal if you're involved with me on anything, frankly. I don't really mind the typos so much, so hopefully you'll forgive me that. So, National DEI Survey. Now, one of the things you're going to notice is sometimes it's EDI, sometimes it's DEI. There's some real conversation right now about whether equity leads to that diversity and inclusion or whether it's diversity leading to equity. So right now, that's a conversation that's occurring. There's no right answer. And like a lot of these things, there's no right answer. And one of the things, I guess, for context for this conversation, I am clearly a educated white person. So I hold a lot of privilege markers in this conversation, and I really acknowledge that. I am part of the gay community, so even in the gay community, I'm on the privileged end. So I really acknowledge that my privilege level is pretty high here. And my commitment to DEI is really about using that privilege where I can to help create change. So context is important. So in the survey, we did have about 580 respondents. As of last night, there's 382 that are considered complete, but there's one question that creates an anomaly. On average, we have roughly 402 participants in the data set, which is actually a population sample for our community. It's actually an excellent sample nationally. And really, we can approach some of these issues with a high degree of validity. As I say, I haven't pulled Alberta-based stats, so this is all national respondents. The respondents from across country is pretty equal. Obviously, OALA makes up the lion's share of these, but that's reflective of the fact that they are actually the lion's share of landscape architects across the country anyway. So they're the big fish, and the rest of us try to balance them out. But we did get a little bit of interaction across the whole country. Obviously, BC and Alberta, we both engaged, Mala supported it, and then the smaller branches, which are smaller at the best of times, supported as well. And we did this French bilingually, so we did get some French respondents as well, which will be fun to see that go through. Okay. This is the same data. This is a different, so the first question asks basically where your home branch is. This question asks where else you maybe hold a membership, and you'll see that the numbers are different. So in Alberta, we are about 16% of the respondent pool. That's the home chapter. Across the country, we reflect about 20% of this data set, and that's largely because it's my survey and I pushed it pretty hard to the members. So I think we've got about 100 respondents in the mix here. In terms of the types of members that engaged, primarily full members, but we did get a smattering of everything else. And one of the questions that came out of Ontario in this conversation was the word industry versus profession. And that was intentional in this survey because our goal was to engage the larger participant pool. It was not just a survey for landscape architects. We wanted to know about downstream and upstream and ancillary. So this went out to a large number of people. And that's probably why you're seeing the word industry versus profession. We had someone comment on it, so I just wanted to address it. From an age distribution, largely as you would expect, a little bit heavier in our younger to mid-career professionals, but they have a higher interest in this area, and it's probably reflective of the overall population of industry. I don't think it's a surprising mix. One of the areas that I find to be fascinating within this data set, and I'm a doctoral student, so data kind of makes me excited, is the prefer not to answer category. In a survey that is about diversity and equity and inclusion, the number of people that chose not to answer any number of questions, I find to be fascinating. Again, it's a completely confidential data set, but it's always fun to me when you're talking about diversity and demographics of our community and you get people who are uncomfortable to answer certain questions. It's quite a fun thing for me. In terms of racialized, this would be a person of the larger definitions. If you're looking for it, the full data set, including the long answers and all the descriptors of all these, is in the session document. So if you want to pull that data and look at it yourself and look at the open-ended questions and all the ideas, I'm going to encourage you to look at some of that. I'll warn you, it's 77 pages. This is the data set here. Many pages of data, tons and tons of open-ended questions with lots of great ideas, which I'm going to push you guys to think about as well. But about, as I say, about 25% of the memberships identified as basically not white. 70% basically did not identify as racialized, and again, 10% didn't feel comfortable to answer that question. Do we, in terms of Indigenous population, roughly 2% identified as Indigenous in some way, shape, or form, 95 were not, and again, 3% chose not to answer. And again, there's some drill down in terms of what category of Indigenous these folks engaged in, but I didn't include that. It's just not, for 8 people, it's not a super helpful data piece. And then, so in the survey, we started off with some of these questions and we finished with demographics, which is why we've jumped like 15 questions ahead. By the way, if you want to ask a question at any point, unmute and hit me with it. You're not going to interrupt me. I don't have flow issues. So if you want to ask questions or make a comment at any point, you can do that. Chat, whatever you want to do there. Any of those will work. We are going to have some discussion as we get further into this, however. Okay, so if I can figure out which thing to click. So in sexual orientation, much broader diversity than I expected. About a quarter of the respondents identified somewhere on the LGBTQ2S IAQ spectrum. And again, 10% of people didn't feel comfortable to say. Whether that means they didn't know, or they're not sure, or they didn't want to disclose, teach their own. But I was surprised by the diversity of the spectrum here, including those that were engaging in some of the more atypical or less well-known respondents. So for those in the call, just for educational content, asexual is a person who does not really have sexual feelings of any sort. Bisexual is usually a person who has a sexual response to both men or women. Gay is usually gay, so inverse sexual relationship. Straight or heterosexual is what it is. Lesbian is obviously female sexual attraction. Pansexual is a newer term, and it reflects a sexual attraction based on an emotive response to a person's personality or being. So it's much more about an intellectual or interpersonal connection and much less about physical traits, as an example. Queer and questioning are old terms, and they cover a wide array of gender spectrum, and it can mean a lot of different things. It really, if you get a queer questioning, you really have to have that conversation with the person about what's going on and where they're at. You can't just, you got to unpack that. And then a two-spirit was the other one. And for the record, one of the things I learned in this process is it's not two-spirited. The ED is not typical. It's two spirits, not two-spirited for some reason. And again, I don't claim to understand it, but that was feedback I was given when we were designing the survey. And then other orientations. And when I last did LGBTQ2S diversity training, I had 16 items on my list. And there's more. I think we're at about 22 or 25 different definitions of sexual orientation. So if you're feeling overwhelmed with definitions, that's fine. Where these definitions are really coming from a basis, I would say, is the younger generation. So I would be the end of the one. The younger generations are rejecting labels in a lot of cases, and their response to rejecting labels is to design a whole pantheon of labels to best address their context. So don't worry about that so much. If you don't know what the term is, ask or Google it. There are some amazing resources. I provided them to a couple of people in this process around sexual orientation and understanding that. So again, sexual orientation, we're talking about sexual relationship. This is about interpersonal. Gender identity, on the other hand, is really about your physical being and your bits. Is the best way to explain this. So sexual orientation is about your emotive qualities with other humans. Your gender identity is really about your personal bits and how you interact with yourself. So again, we asked the question, 375 people had a traditional binary response, male or female. We didn't have anyone identifying as transgender at this time. We had some non-binary folks, which basically is folks that don't identify as male or female on spectrum. Gender fluid, again, we didn't have any of that, but that's more about non-binary versus gender fluid. Non-binary typically is a rejection of male-female stereotypes, whereas gender fluidity usually reflects the fact that sometimes that may be more male identified and sometimes more female identified based on context, feeling that day, or that, in that period. So there's a non-binary is basically a rejection of the binary, whereas gender fluidity tends to be more of a movement within the spectrum. Questioning is same as queer and questioning. On the other side is someone who's working through it. Prefer not to answer was about 5%, which again is really interesting to me in this data set, or the 5 folks that picked something else. And again, probably up to about 20 different definitions in this area. So it's not surprising that we didn't, and we did actually do an open-ended question. So for some of these, we do have some respondents there, and I haven't had a chance to unpack those and figure out what's going on there. One of the things I have discovered in surveying our populations is that there is a real sense of specificity that some of the members really seem to want to have. If I don't list their exact thing using the exact words, the way they identify, and this works in terms of, like, this is as much relevant in gender and sexual identity as it is in terms of what type of member they are. Like we've got some people that you know, we had a retired category and a semi-retired, and yet they still put, I am a retired, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, so you're retired. That's you right there. When the one that says retired, I'm not sure why you felt the need to type that out for me, but it does happen in all of our survey data. This is not unique to this survey at all. Do you identify as religious? Again, I was surprised by this one, not by the 10% who wouldn't respond, but that 70% of the members don't identify as religious in any way. I can't wait to look through the specificity bits. Most people just say yes, and yet 60 people took time not only to acknowledge their religious affiliation, but felt the need to explicitly tell me what it was, rather than just saying, yes, I'm religious, which I can't wait to unpack that. That alone is going to be so much fun to figure out why again, it's that specificity that some of the members really crave, where they want to tell me it's not enough to say I'm religious. They want me to know that they're a Orthodox Roman Catholic, or they're a Reformed Druid, or whatever that thing is. So it'll be fun to unpack that. By the way, the Druid thing is a mass joke. Do you identify as a person with a disability or chronic medical condition? Again, coming up with an acceptable definition for the 4 branches took us, some of those folks were in the room, I think it must have taken us a week or 2 to come up with those. So it was really interesting for me to get a sense of how that came about. So I'm just curious how the other sessions are doing. So again, 85% said no, and 5% didn't want to identify. So here we get into the data now. So you've got a sense of the demographics that we got, good data set. We're going to start to drill into the level of agreement. And I want to disclaimer this. Again, I got the data set last night. So in this data set, and these slides are available to you, the session is recorded. So don't, like, if you're taking furious notes, don't feel you have to do that. I've provided all this to you. We get now into the senses of the meat and potatoes of what we were curious about. And in all of these, I have taken certain liberties, and I will try to remember to disclose them as I go through. Enrica's sort of stuck in there, and she works at the U of C, and I know she's like, university folks are always like, what are the assumptions? What have you done in the background? Own your stuff. So I'm waiting for fun comments and questions and challenges based on some of the decisions I've made and how to present this data to you, because I definitely have an intention in my data. This is not a dispassionate production of facts for you. So I've definitely taken some liberties with the data. So again, this is a level of agreement with the following statements. This was a question of feelings of diversity. Do you agree we are diverse? And so I clustered, so this one is industry, looking at landscape architecture as an industry as well as in the workplace. And again, we're seeing here roughly close to 40% felt that landscape architecture as an industry was diverse, but much higher rate of feelings of diversity, closer to 50%, a little more than 50% actually, in terms of workplaces. So definitely a feeling that workplaces are much more diverse than we reflect in the larger industry, which was interesting to me. And I'm not going to unpack that. It's just, that was the way the survey data came across. However, once we looked into the components, CSLA across the country, things changed. People felt that their component, and again, keep in mind, you've got coast to coast to coast in this data set, they felt their component was fairly diverse, but largely across the country we're not. So the perception that, say, Alberta is very diverse, but BC and Saskatchewan are not, is a very interesting us versus them dilemma that it'll be interesting to play with that information over time, because it was consistent. We believed our stuff was more diverse than other people's stuff, which I find to be, again, there's lots to unpack there. In terms of the diversity of the volunteer population, again, home components still very low. So in these, I used agree, disagree. So anyone who responded in this section as neutral would have gone in the disagree. So when I say agree, those are the strong agreeers and the agree, but the neutral, disagree, strongly disagree, that's the do not agree pile. That's where I drew that line. So the neutral, there's a lot of neutral in a lot of these data sets, but for me, if you're neutral on diversity, that's usually a sign that you don't think you're diverse. It's not usually that if you don't know if you're diverse, that's usually more of a no than a yes, but it's in the larger data set, as we unpack this, there is a section of neutral in all of these. But it was still surprising to me that only 25% of folks thought their home component volunteer base was diverse. Now, when I look around our volunteer communities in Alberta, I'm not totally shocked to hear that. I mean, we have a lot of white people, and certainly a lot more males in some cases, although at some of the other communities, less so. But it was an interesting comment. But again, nationally, 20% thought that nationally we're diverse. And it's that us-them conversation that really does seem to become part of this section of the data. Feelings of belonging was much more about, it's still within diversity, but it's in that question of, do you feel like you are part of the community? And this was, I was much happier with this data set. So almost 80% of people thought they felt like they fit in at work. Unfortunately, that means over 20% don't feel like they fit in at their workplace. Same thing at the component, 65, 70, almost 70% felt like they did belong. But that still leaves 30-odd% that don't feel like they belong. And that to me starts to create an area where we can really attack things and try to fix that problem. To me, that's about, this is one of the change ones. Feelings of belonging, there's a lot we can do to create senses of belonging and start to build that trust. And again, feel like I belong at CSLA drops again. But I think a lot of that one, as I processed this feelings of belonging at CSLA, we have a huge proportion of the membership that don't get to go to those national conferences. They're not senior enough in their organization, so they're not going to get support to go to CSLA. So it's tougher to have a sense of belonging in an agency where you've never had the opportunity to meaningfully participate. It'd be really interesting to do this survey again in a microcosm where the Congress is just held. So had we been able to host the 2020 conference here in Alberta, it would have been fun to do a data set with our members pre-conference and post-conference. Because once that conference has been in your community, I suspect your feelings of belonging would jump up in a positive way. The next question we looked at was inclusion and how important is this issue to you? Again, good response rate here, 270s for sure a population sample. And so what I've given you here is very important, important, and not important, because so not important would include neutral, not important, very not important, very unimportant. So again, feelings of inclusion across the board here, this has a high value. We're talking 85 to 90%, whether it's at their job, at their component, nationally, or in the industry, felt that this is an important issue. And that's really great in terms of a flip response. It's hard for me to marry this stat of importance and the nature of it, and then look at the problems we're having with recruiting national committees and provincial committees to do the work that deals with this area. Everyone on paper says it's really important to them, and then we start to ask for volunteers to get involved and get engaged, and we start to have problems. So for me, this is a tough one. It's good that, it's a good metric when I'm arguing for funding and support to do this work, but it's tougher when we get into the idea of, so who's going to do the work? Familiar with the policies. This is my favorite stat in the whole deck. So, and I didn't touch this. This came right out of the system. So, are you familiar with the policies of inclusion and diversity? 35% of the CSLA folks said that they were familiar with those policies. And Michelle and I had this conversation because there aren't any. So 35% of people are familiar with a policy which does not in fact exist. That is a hugely humorous stat for me. And frankly, home component, Alberta does have some very limited, but if you're not in the regulatory committees or on the board, you've never even seen those policies. And yet 40% of the members feel really confident about those. So it'll be fun for me to unpack that with Alberta data. And then not surprisingly, 75 to 80% really comfortable with their workplace policy, but that's HR 101. Everyone who has a policy, I wouldn't be shocked if the 15 to 20% that don't feel comfortable are really in small organizations where there may be a lack. But this was a super fun one because Michelle and I had a long conversation about whether we were even going to include the question, knowing that in most cases this policy doesn't even exist. So to know that our members feel really confident that they know and understand these policies when they don't exist has got a whole humor value to me that I can't even tell you. And I mean, there is elements of these policies for all of us at every level, but there is no explicit, like if you said, Todd, can I have the diversity policy? I would say, well, section X of the Code of Conduct for Volunteers sort of covers that. But other than that, yeah, this is an area where we can do better, certainly. And again, effectiveness of these same policies. And again, I'm going to go back to the fact that, 15, 16% of CSLA members feel they're very effective or very effective for policies that really don't exist. Same thing, 20% in home components. I like this one. I feel a lot better about that. You're getting 40% of the things going, I'm not sure if they're effective or not effective. That probably is a really good answer in terms of the fact that I don't think most of these policies really exist, or they're not, it's clearly not effectively transparent. This is a slide where I was shocked. I'm going to preface this right now. Have I experienced discrimination? Now, in the actual survey, we ask a whole array of locations and a whole array of types, and I've really brought this data set tight. So there's a huge richness of information here that I really couldn't capture in a couple-hour conversation. I mean, I could have done literally 2 hours on the experiences of discrimination. So what you're getting here is average. So the percentage of respondents who said they had, for example, felt discrimination based on race. And when I looked at the data set, the meaningful jump for me was workplace versus the average. So the average, the full set included, have I had it on social media with my peers? Have I had it at component or events or communications? Have I had it at national events and communications? Have I had an industry? And really, this one I think is an area where workplace becomes a really important conversation, because on average, only 5% of people felt they'd had discrimination based on race, but 12% of people said in their workplace they had an issue. That's a meaningful statistic to me. Absolutely, Maggie. There is certainly a possibility that the recent context has shifted these numbers. Had we done this survey prior to Black Lives Matter, it would be really interesting to see what that comparison. Unfortunately, until that event, we didn't know we needed the data. So there's a lot of conversation about data collection that we're going to talk about in the discussion section. Problems with discrimination based on ethnicity, again, 5 and 12% respectively. Ability and disability, a little bit lower, actually, was better. I'm really disappointed in the center stat, which is gender. Gender discrimination, 12% of our members are still feeling like there's gender discrimination in the broadest context of industry on average, but almost 37% of respondents indicated they had experienced an instance of gender-based discrimination in their workplace, which is shocking in a profession where 40 to 60% of the membership are female. We have a high gender balance trending on towards the female side of things, and yet we're seeing this level of gender-based discrimination. So that I was quite shocked by this section, to be honest. I was also shocked that the levels of instances of sexual orientation is so low, especially with an Alberta context. Yeah, Shannon, I don't know. And again, I'm going to push you guys to unmute and say things out loud. But Shannon's comment was larger male-dominated companies, but ultimately male-dominated companies within the industry, it's a very high female percentage. So I think we need to unpack that. We need to have those conversations. Because I don't know, usually in larger organizations, discrimination is less likely because you have strong HR policy to support overcoming those issues. It could be small firms, actually, where you're lacking in strong HR support. So it'll be interesting to unpack that.
Yeah, I think so. I'm unmuted now. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I wonder though, in some of the larger organizations, if there's a discomfort in making a complaint, depending on the way the organization has operated. So
absolutely.
There's probably a lot of unpacking in that.
You know what,
Yeah.
I wouldn't be shocked if all of these, as we share them with the larger industry and we see some of the firms get access to this data, I wouldn't be shocked if there's a lot of unpacking across the spectrum, because I suspect if you were to do internal survey and ask the HR professionals, they'd say, no, we're on top of this. And while clearly if 40% of respondents nationally are saying they've had an incident, we're not on top of it.
Yeah.
So I agree. This slide has a whole opportunity for training and mandating education and unpacking what's going on in workplaces and reporting procedures. There's a huge, when we get into how do we fix this in context of areas, there's a huge opportunity here for us to really unpack and talk about how do we deal with this, for sure. Religious, again, sexual orientation was pretty low. I thought that was quite good, actually. Religion, again, both of those are very taboo now in Canadian society, so I'm not totally shocked that they're pretty low. And then again, age, I'm not actually surprised by the age one. There's a very young, up and coming profession in the industry. It doesn't surprise me at all to see age has got a lot of instances of problems. I mean, I've had those conversations with members, especially to me, this is definitely a large firm. You know, you're young, they're working you hard, you're not feeling validated and supported. So I think this one was a really interesting one, but some of these have given us some areas where we definitely need to tackle things, which was surprising when we were primarily, we were considering the intent, the initiator of this research was tied to race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. The fact that our primary issue of reported incidents is in gender and age, frankly, it may refocus some of the need a little bit. But it's an interesting data set, and there's a ton to unpack here. Like I say, there's the 7 metrics left to right, but there's literally 12 criteria that we use to look at this and really break it down, which I just have summarized here. Questions. It's a lot of data. I just hit you with 30 minutes of straight data. Questions about the data set, how we got here, before we jump into the sort of discussion phase. You're usually a pretty chatty bunch, so I'm betting you there's some discussion here.
We're doing, we did a diversity, equity, and inclusion survey at my company recently. And so it's interesting because this is coinciding with that. But my company is an American company. So the data that came from that is vastly different in terms of like race discrimination. So it's interesting for me, being in Canada, to see like firsthand that dichotomy between Canada and the US in terms of racial discrimination.
Yes, absolutely. Other comments about the data set, Maggie?
I think the other component to like the discrimination in the workplace is not necessarily the company, it's more dealing with contractors and that mentality too. It's hard as a female to deal with a largely older male dominated contractor situation, and I think it's maybe not the employees. I don't think that's the issue, but well, there's still work to be done, obviously, with pay equity and that as well. But just the understanding that we have to deal with old men sometimes. and
a lot of those high numbers are from the industry line, where not so much in your firm, or a lot of it really does align with that thought, that it's the larger context that landscape architecture fits within the larger, broader context of industry is very definitely clear in the data set as well. I think that comment is well supported by the data we've collected. Michelle. You're muted somehow, Michelle. You don't look muted, but we can't hear you. Technical glitch. We'll give you a minute and we'll come back. Other questions on the data set? Michelle, try again. I see you unmuted. Yeah, we're definitely not hearing you. There's about 25 of you in the room. There must be more responses. Male, female. Other thoughts? Questions on the data set? I'm going to give you one more chance, and then I'm going to loop you into the work. It's time to put the rubber where the road is. All right, so if Michelle gets unmuted, we'll carry on here. So the goal of today's session within the context of the data provided is to really start to drill into some core questions around what do we do about it. I don't think we've shocked anyone with our data collection. I don't think I don't think that's an issue. So what I'd like to do is really push folks to think about this. What can we do different? What can we do better? And I'm going to sort of ask everyone to set aside for the moment. One of the core things I'm hearing in conversations nationally is this idea that if you're not Black, Indigenous, a person of color, or LGBTQ, you don't have an opportunity to have a conversation about what can be done about this. And I rejected that utterly. I am a highly privileged white guy, and I happen to be gay, but other than that, but I believe firmly that I have lots of things, and my partners from across the country at the staff table will tell you I stand up and I'll comment and I'll challenge those assumptions. So I really want everyone in the room to feel comfortable that there are no dumb ideas, there are no wrong answers here. If you have a sense of what can be done, or a suggestion or an idea, even if it maybe doesn't benefit you personally, it's something you've seen or experienced or heard secondhand, these are all valuable. And so the first sort of area that I thought we would contextualize, and again, we're going to look at all three. So we're going to talk about within our respective memberships in terms of CSLA or Alberta. We're going to talk about schools and workplaces and things we can do there. And that doesn't necessarily mean, that could be something that we as associations do with your workplace or school. And the third context is in our interactions with the public. You all do public consultation and public education. And so I don't care where on these three spectrums we start this conversation. So I'm going to challenge someone to pick up a thread and start to talk about it. And if you're on your computer and you have the space on the screen, there is tons and tons, like literally 20. I'll tell you right now, there is literally 43 pages of suggestions in the data set. And so there's no wrong answers here. So I'm going to encourage anyone who's got an idea to throw it at the wall. We'll see what sticks. The session's being recorded, so I'll go through and I'll drill down into this later. But anyone have any suggestions, urgent ideas, starting points that they want to throw out there for discussion?
One thing that I just wanted to bring up was further to Maggie's point about sometimes male contractors picking on female consultants, is just being a good ally. So if me as a white man, hearing that, if that comes an ally for that. So do you need assistance in that? Like, is there something that I can do to help you through this? Do I need to bring you to HR or anything like that? So just, again, being a good ally for that group, for everything else. So listening, being open-minded, all those things.
Do you feel like, whether it's in an association or a personal context, do you feel like you have the tools that you need to do that effectively? Is that an area where maybe the association? Yeah,
not even just personally, like not me helping personally, but being able to be a sounding board. So if I'm here, if I want to feel like my coworkers or my association, anybody can come to me with problems, and then, bringing it to the right people to work with, right? So
that's great. Other thoughts? Anyone want to tag off of that? There's a lot of you in the room. I'm guessing there's some ideas here.
One of the things that we've heard from our Black employees is having somebody, they say having somebody who looks like me in a position, so within the AALA, for example, if all of the committee members and all of the board members are white, or I know there's men and women, but if they're all white, there's nobody for them, for the younger Black members or people of color to have that mentorship, or I don't know, it sets a tone. And yeah,
I agree. I know when we did the last jury recruiting, we prioritized, and I want to be careful how I say this, all qualifications being equal and all candidates being valid, we prioritized female jury members or people of color in our selection process. So we did the initial screening to go, who is everyone meet the criteria? Is everyone roughly on the same experience level? We dealt with that first, and then from what was left, we tried quite deliberately to select people of color or females, knowing that we literally started off with 10 white men, or largely white men. There's a couple of non-Indigenous people of color in those mixes. But we did that very deliberately, and we ended up recruiting, we had 3 positions and we brought on 3 females. I think we're still pretty white, but we did better. But I think the conversation, and I throw this to the larger group, thinking of, committee members in a volunteer organizations, there's always that chicken and the egg conversation is, so you have a hard time recruiting people because, we want more diversity in the room, but people don't feel comfortable to apply because there's no diversity. How do you overcome that? Like it's a very much a chicken and the egg conversation. And I'd love some ideas. There's lots of faces in the room. I can see lots of people muting and muting. Look for who's got a thought. How do we fix that? I mean, it's your association. How do we fix it? I mean, I can see past presidents on the call. I can see committee members, scholarship winners. You guys have been around. How do we fix this?
Maybe I'll just say something from the student side of things, partly because I'm involved with it at our school at the University of Calgary. But since the current Black Lives Matters movement had really taken off this summer, our school, and it started from our students, had really put the notice to the faculty that we wanted that change. And a lot of us had come together to form organizations and within our student body and pushing our school and our professors to put more content and put our voices in terms of diversity and equity and inclusion in the dialogue. And we are doing our own events as well and inviting the general public to jump in and be a part of it. And I think what we're looking for in terms of the student body as well is like, we're trying to find our voice in the industry as we move into it. But we're also wondering, how is the industry taking this data that you've provided? And I know it's super fresh, but how are you going to put it in a context of learning to listen to people that do not see themselves in a position of power, that may identify with different aspects of color, race, age, or gender?
I think it's a great question, and I know for sure the national group that's working on the BLM, BIPOC stuff, it was very excited to have this data set. And I think one of the things we, as the branches really talked about was the fact that this survey is not perfect, and there's more data to be found. But part of that, the flip side is, how do we use this data in a meaningful way? Like as much as the general sense of where we're at is really important, the 50, 60 pages we have of suggestions is really, to me, an important part of that. The other thing, and I want to pick up, and I'd love to have other comments on this, is that sense of power relationship. One of the things we were very careful about in this survey is it is literally as completely blind coded as any survey can possibly be, short of like mailing things and having hidden drop boxes. There's no, because one of the things I'm always concerned about, especially with younger professionals, is I don't want younger professionals to feel at risk because they're putting their neck out there and making comments on this area, which in some cases may not be well received. So we've done a lot of work in the way we're collecting data and the way we're bouncing back out to try to provide some assurance that you're not putting your career at risk to get involved and have a voice. And so that's, to me, one of the things that we may see over time is an opportunity for some people that are willing to be out there and be out front on this, to be visible. Because visibility, I can tell you from the gay community, visibility is a huge part of it. I can do more by being who I am and being visible as a member of the community sometimes than I can at a protest rally with a banner, to be fair. In fact, I have a friend of mine who I grew up with who lives in Olds, where I grew up, and he married he runs one of the most successful restaurants in town. He and his partner got married. They were on Facebook. They've adopted. They've done more for gay rights in that community than I could do in 100 years of protests, because they've been out and transparent and they're normal and they normalize. And for our community, that's a big deal. But to me, that's a big part of this conversation, is how do we move the ball forward without people feeling at risk of their career. I mean, even watching this session, there's a couple of people that have been, I'm seeing phone numbers for the first time, which I've never seen on the call all morning. Everyone's been logged in and it's transparent, but some people even to attend the session have felt that need to step one step back and call in so that their confidentiality is maintained. So to me, that's a big part of this question, is how do we move this forward and support our younger members that are really driving a lot of this to feel like they can do that and not imperil their career. So I've thoughts on that. There's a lot of young professionals in the room based on the list of names I'm seeing here. You're all very quiet. Grace, I see.
Yes, hi guys. I think having mentorship is important, but also like peer mentorship. So before, I'm in Toronto now, but before I left, I think BEA, Building Equity in Architecture, just opened up a chapter in Calgary, and you really get a chance to meet people that are in other kind of close professions too, like in urban planning and urban design and in construction. So it's not just kind of within your own design or like your industry. So I thought that was like a safe place for me to kind of have that discussion. And when you feel like other people want to have that dialogue too, it's just, there's more ideas that gets kind of put out.
Great.
So connecting with organizations like that, but yeah.
Yeah, no, and they're getting a lot of traction. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, they started at Manitoba, that group, and are starting to move kind of across the country.
In Toronto, I think,
Toronto.
BAT.
Nice. So drawing back to the sort of three spheres of questioning, we talked about school and workplaces. Is there training that's needed? Is there context? What should obviously, from this session, the hope is to leave here and know where does Alberta go from here, especially? What do we want to do next? I mean, Ontario is forming a committee that's doing some work on this. They're looking at recruiting a specialist. CSLA is also forming a national committee. So we're going to see some of that work occurring. What should Alberta's role be? I mean, where should we be going? I mean, that's part of, you're all members here in one way or another. That's how you got in the room. So I'm interested to hear some suggestions about what do you think the priorities for us are? Is it education? Is it training? Is it data collection so we can describe the industry? What does that look like?
It would be interesting to see the data broken down based, like, for Alberta members to understand then where our gaps are, because it's like we have countrywide data, but that's going to vary across the membership groups. So I think once we break it down into like Alberta specific, it might be easier to see where we need to work on things, like what our direction needs to be. Like there's general direction, like in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But specific to Alberta, like it's hard to know what our next steps are.
True. On the flip side, I can say from the national data we've collected on other surveys, we typically are a relatively homogeneous interprovincially. The only time we see big swings in the data sets in other surveys historically have been obviously the North typically can have some really different variables, and the Francophone group can be somewhat different, but typically Alberta, BC, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Manitoba are generally fairly homogeneous and across membership. So the data is probably pretty similar, but we will be doing that Alberta-based drill down for sure. The problem is you can't filter, it's a two variable filter because it's not only people who live here, but it's also the people that have licensure here. So it's,
right.
Otherwise in SurveyMonkey, I would just click the Alberta people and see what we get. Sometimes we still do that, but.
Do we feel there's a lack of diversity in terms of race in our membership? A lack of students staying in Alberta and being a part of the AALA? Are they moving away? Like where do we see those gaps?
Yeah.
Like you said, our membership is about 40 to 60% female, so it seems like there's a relative balance there.
Yeah, one of
Okay.
the suggestions that came forward, and I would love some feedback from this group because the board is unsure of how to proceed, is the question of collecting that data.
Okay.
So one of the opportunities really is every year when people renew, we have the ability to add mandated fields. So for example, this year we're adding a series of mandated attestations, basically to say that you are not aware of anyone acting unethically, that you yourself have not been acting unethically, and that you've read your digital stamp and seal policy and you've understood it and had an opportunity to ask questions about it. Those three for sure are going into the attestations for this year. So when you renew your membership in Alberta, you will have to attest, I am not aware that anyone has been acting unethically and failed to report it. I have not acted unethically in any way that I know of, and I have read this policy and I'm adhering to it. Largely those sorts of questions are usually tied to the fact that we're about to ramp up enforcement in areas, and we want to give everyone that last chance to make sure that they've read the policy and understood it and had an opportunity to ask any related questions. But I mean, there's certainly within the data set, we have a massive and really effective database. We could ask questions like, do you identify as LGBTQ? Do you identify as Indigenous? Or do you identify as a person of color? We could collect that data, but it's a somewhat invasive question. So that's really, I put it to the group. Is that something we should be doing? If we do anonymized results, it's anonymous data, which again, the nice thing about demographic data, if people are okay with it being collected, is it doesn't really typically, other than some of the gender and sexual identity spectrum stuff can shift, but most of the time, if you're a female, you're generally a female, unless you transition, or if you're Indigenous, you tend to stay Indigenous forever. You don't really have to answer that question every year. So to me, that's one of the areas, is that something we should be doing? And there's like 30 of you in the room, so I'd love to hear who's at O2. You keep unmuting and try to talk.
It's Caitlin Dunning. I was on my phone and then I quickly switched to my computer and realized I logged in with my O2 account.
That's okay.
Sorry.
I can see you unmuting. So go to.
Yeah. So yeah, Caitlin Dunning here. You raise an interesting point with ethics, actually. So something that you often see with other professional organizations is you actually can't even get a stamp without writing an ethics exam. It's actually the only exam you usually have to write. So like they don't have like a Larry's kind of thing. They just write an ethics exam to understand what the implications are of joining that professional organization. So I wonder if that could be a component to kind of push some of these mandates that we want to integrate, because it is an ethical question in the end.
It's certainly a good question. Thoughts on that? I have some thoughts on using examinations, but it's not tied to the ethical framework. It's tied to the scary, expensive nature of written examination. But
Yeah.
I think the conversation's valid anyway. Whether it's an exam or a different process, let's not get caught up on that part. I think the idea of the idea of ethics is good.
Yeah.
I think there's parts of it that are ethical, like you can't, like, not discriminating, but I think there's also parts of it that are just changes in the way that we practice and the way that we I don't know how to explain it, like the way that we present ourselves, which I don't know. I think it's borderline whether, like, I don't know how to explain it.
That's right. Mindset versus perhaps ethical. To me, the question with ethics is usually ethics is a question of intention, and sometimes people act unethically intentionally, and that's different than someone who doesn't. Like, to me, that's that education versus intention question that is often a part of an ethical, especially from a licensure and discipline perspective. A huge part of those conversations can be intention. To be fair, if you were to act, if you were to be discriminatory, it would bring ill favor upon the profession, and we would have disciplinary means to address that behavior if we had to. But it's interesting. It's an interesting dynamic to the question. Are there parts of this equation that we haven't talked about that you'd hope we delve into? We're under no obligation to fill 2 hours. So if we feel like we've torn this apart and we're in a good place, the biggest thing to me is I'd like to, from this group, a sense of where do we go from here? I mean, obviously we've heard that we definitely want to drill further into the data set, which we're definitely going to do. But what other ideas, what other needs, thoughts do you need time to unpack? Where do we go from here? Data is data. If you don't do anything with it, it's just data. My aunt is vice provost. She said lots of great research happens and no one ever does anything with it because it never gets written up. So the question is, where do we go from here?
I think personally some training, some webinars, or I'm not exactly sure what that looks like, would be good just to understand it's a lot. There's a lot of things that are going on right now, and I think Alberta are the next big thing in Alberta, I think, is reconciliation, or it is ongoing, and understanding those complexities, or how to even how to even approach or start approaching moving forward, and I guess healing. I don't know. I'm not sure how to say that, but I feel like in our industry we're in a bit of a transition from the old mentality of how we used to do things and how we're moving forward. Like there's more. Well, you see it with the students that are coming through U of C. It's no longer just the white people that are doing design school now. It's and that's going to change our whole dynamic. So yeah, like from my own experience going through grad school, it used to be like it was the first time that 50% female students, or there was more female students than male students going through architecture, and that's all those small bits and pieces of as the demographics change, our way of doing things will naturally change too. But dealing with the bigger questions of yeah, I think that's the biggest thing, reconciliation right now. It's maybe not Black Lives Matter up here as much, but it's definitely the Indigenous population and how we move forward. I don't know.
You know, and I think that feeling, Maggie, and I invite others to comment on it, because I was at a session. It was so Dr. Reg Croshu at the Parks Forum that ARPA holds we had a half a day, and I think there was all of maybe 10 of us, 10 white people, and Dr. Reg Croshu and his wife, whose name I forever cannot remember. I need to look it up and like memorize it. And I posed that same question. I said, where do you start? How do you start? Because it's not like, you know, if you have an incident, you're in crisis intervention, you know, I need to get some training and I do X, but how do you start that conversation with reconciliation? And I was posing it from the context of the provincial organization. Obviously, for AALA, where do we begin? Because we're not really, you know, if you're in Edmonton, you tend to go to the surrounding communities and have conversation. If you're in Calgary, you go to Siksika, you go to Susina, you go to and you start a conversation. When you're a provincial organization, that really, I mean, we are based in Edmonton, but that's because where my house is. If I moved to Calgary, we'd be based in Calgary that week. Like that's how that works. Because I mean, that's how that is. So the question is, how do you get started? And for us as a provincial organization, it's tough unless there's some leaders that really want to drill into it. It's tough to find that starting point. But what Reg said was really, it's that point of contact. Find that human you want to connect to, find that group that you have a connection, and find a meaningful starting point for that conversation. I mean, U of C is doing some amazing work in this area, and is doing some real leadership, and has really done a great job of meaningfully connecting to their surrounding Indigenous communities. City of Edmonton is doing some phenomenal work, and they were great. I attended an educational session that they put on, and they did the classic thing. And luckily I'd done this right before the board put it on the strategic plan, is they had gone and sat down as municipalities do and came up with their plan for reconciliation. And then they emailed the copy over to Enoch and said, okay, this is how we're going to reconcile with you. Didn't really work out that well. Let's just, it's a tough concept to understand, that reconciliation is a conversation. It's not like you don't get to pre-plan it. And it took the board of the day, I think, Dorina, were you in the room at that time when we did the strat planning session in Stantec's old offices? Were you on the board then? Do you remember, like it was the funniest facilitation. We spent, what, 5 minutes determining we should have reconciliation and put that on the agenda. And then we spent 55 minutes with me repeatedly saying, there is no plan. I don't have a plan. We can't have a plan until we get some Indigenous people in the room. Like, but for you guys as planners, that was the toughest thing. And like, you were there, Drina. Do you remember?
I remember it. I remember putting it on there and saying, yes, we need to do this. But yeah, it's difficult. I think it's not easy to talk about, and that's why we're trying to do this, but I don't know how we can do it better.
Enrica.
I mean, it is not a thought strictly related to the data, but I was wondering if we can also address the subject, the topic of diversity in our profession, diversity in landscape architecture approaches, people that are doing innovative things, where they come from, the cultural identity, etc. So, because sometimes we tend to look at our local environment because, yes, we know better the environment, the needs, but if we want to talk about diversity, and still we are landscape architects, so why don't start culturally in terms of enlarging opportunities to have, to listen to voices that are landscape architects or maybe are not landscape architects as registered professionals, because it is quite Western and European American concept. So maybe we have landscape architecture without that definition in many other contexts. So if we try to understand how people are transforming the environment and try to invite from different cultures to talk about what we call landscape architecture, but could be called also in other ways. So I think that is diversity too, and it can provide that kind of broader picture that can attract local professionals, local students to identify themselves for their future as landscape designers. Because maybe they see, they hear other voices that are not just from one single cultural heritage, because what we are talking about saying landscape architecture, unfortunately, as an association is based on a few countries' culture. So that is my suggestion, to start to think about maybe, yes, gender, sexual orientation, etc., but diversity in landscape architecture, or even diversity in the way we conceived who is contributing to the transformation of the land. That can be landscape architect, registered, but can be a lot of other things and people.
That's such a good idea that you brought up, and I was just thinking that I wasn't even exposed to landscape architecture until I was in architecture school, like in university. So there's definitely a lack of exposure of this profession to like high school kids and just kind of the general public, because I still have to clarify to my in-laws like what I do is not plant flowers, you know. And even when I was in architecture school, kind of landscape architecture 101 was, okay, the founding fathers of this profession is Frederick Law Olmsted and Central Park and High Line, like always used as kind of the go-to precedents. But yes, the way people shape the land, you know, it predates that, and kind of exactly like the way we talk about landscape architecture as a profession and its history needs to be broadened, because in China and Iran, like there's so many beautiful gardens and histories that aren't taught in schools. Maybe that's changing now, but when I was in design school, it was very focused on kind of European gardens and histories and theories.
We hear that a lot in these conversations, that the broadening of the context and the historical placement and the internationality of it it's frequently something that comes up. And it's certainly something, again, to try to shift the thinking into more practical examples. If everyone, like, I'm seeing a lot of head nodding as Grace and Enrico started this conversation. The question to me then is that maybe a major initiative for next year, is that we look to launch a series of exposure opportunities. I mean, they're going to start off as webinars because it's COVID.
That was a bit an idea. Can be more focused on inviting people, running firms that deal with landscape design somehow from different parts of the world, from different cultures, males, females. So also trying to have this kind of diversity in the approach, but also in the person, because I think that every time it is about people. So people are running a firm, or people are working together for a project, and they bring their own background. So having the opportunity to listen to voices that can, I would say, that can share both the landscape architecture work they are doing, but also a kind of a personal experience as a Black man, or so trying to create that linkages between the individual's identity and the contributions they brought or they are bringing into a firm, into a project, into the industry or a university, whatever, because I think they are not separated. So if we really think what for us in this context is important is, on one hand, landscape architecture as a profession, and on the other hand, people and the diversity of the people that are doing that. So if we are able to think about a series of talks or venues that we can invite or join, because it can be us joining other programs, if we know that there are similar things going on, or we can invite, or we can share. So that, yes, I would say, I don't have a very detailed idea because I just was brainstorming today, but that was the meaning.
Oh, I like that. I mean, from a staff perspective, I can get my teeth around that. I can build whether it's like, I think it could be a webinar series next year or a speaker series that would be more digital, but in time, it'd be nice to be able to bring some of those folks in. If you've ever had the opportunity to listen to Tom Walsh is a bad example because he's a white guy, but he is so passionate about the work he did at the Aga Khan Garden and some of his team. Like, there's some conversations around that in terms of Islamic art and in the Ismaili community. We actually just had a session with the New Zealanders. It'd be interesting to have a New Zealander come in, or a Maori person come in and talk about the Maori interaction with landscape design in terms of their cultural context, where their indigenous community has been very successful in regaining rights as well. I mean, there's definitely examples. We had actually, today we'd have reached out to a Black landscape designer who's apparently headlining for ASLA, which explains his price. But we couldn't get him today. He had a personal conflict. So those people exist that can bring that cultural, personal context to the work and marry together really well. I think that's achievable. Other comments on this theme that people have, or other themes now that we're starting to get some sort of things thrown at the board?
I also like the idea of focusing on like who we're building these landscapes for, like particularly in the public sector. Like these places aren't for white people, like they're for women, and they're for children, and they're for indigenous people, they're for homeless people. They're like, we need to recognize that there's a lot of consultation that has to go into some spaces, and we can't assume that one application will work for everybody. So project examples where extensive consultation. For like when we did 96th Street here in Edmonton, we didn't take into account that it was in a neighborhood where there is a high number of Chinese elders, and the art that was chosen bothered them quite a bit. And so it ended up having to be moved because it represented this demon in Chinese folklore. So just situations like that, that you wouldn't think about, but need to be taken into account.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know Michael was talking about a facilitation they just did for, was it Stephen Avenue, or I think it's Stephen Avenue project, and that was a very similar theme about the local homeless population. Did you want to talk about that, Michael?
Sure. Yeah, actually, thanks for prompting that, Todd. Sorry, I missed the first half. I was at rapid fire, but this is a great conversation from what I've heard. Stephen Avenue has been really interesting because on one hand, we have quite a few retail store owners and restaurant owners who are frankly upset with the vulnerable population who tend to frequent the avenue. I continue to mourn what I call the last public bench on Stephen Avenue, which was removed in front of Winners this summer. And now we've basically made it very difficult for the elderly to go to Stephen Avenue because they, you know, we learned from them, they can only walk a block before they have to rest for 5 minutes, and then they can walk another block. So, you know, I think our intentions are often good, but they impact other groups. With respect to Stephen Avenue, we have done a couple things, and I'm just going to try and share my screen here. In the report, which is on calgary.ca/Stephen Avenue, you can find our report from Gal Studio out of San Francisco. But this was actually an equity, diversity, inclusion, access statement that Kate Zago, my kind of deputy PM, authored herself. She's not here today, but I want to commend Kate for her work here. She actually borrowed some of Todd's ideas when we had, Todd put out some really great communications when Black Lives Matter came up. And it was almost, I don't want to say it's an apology, Todd, I don't know what you would call it, but you basically just admitted that there's lots of work to do and we're going to make mistakes, but we're going to try. And that's really what this statement is doing. So we sort of, you know, talked about the context of it, and Kate and I worked together on developing some actions essentially. So we do have a policy of inclusiveness in our engage strategy. We look at accessibility as an essential component for Stephen Avenue. We're going to be doing a lot of activations and experiments and pilots. And one of the ways that we want to ensure inclusivity in those is try different things that work for different user groups and really see how it works, but also invite those diverse voices to participate in us designing, building, installing, and using the kind of interventions that we're going to be trying over the next couple of years. We've heard fairly strongly from Councillor Gondek, who represents a suburban community here in Calgary, or a suburban ward, that you need to have these conversations with a wider net of Calgarians too. And a lot of the new communities or outlying communities are actually predominantly minorities, visible minorities. And so they felt that we need to do a better job engaging them. We also recognize that we can't police our way out of a lot of the vulnerable population issues, which are tied to just like systemic racism and all kinds of underlying social issues caused to that. So we recognize we can't police our way out of that sort of vulnerable population and sometimes causing conflict on the avenue. So we see more of a social service approach towards that. One of the things we've done is actually put forward a pilot for an ambassador program, which started with the 9 Block and Stephen Avenue area. Calgary Downtown Association is a partner with that, and a bunch of other groups. But they're really out there on the street. They're almost acting as first touch, first contact people for social services to help direct you to maybe the dope team or to some social services. But at the same time, they're also providing wayfinding services to tourists, and they're promoting local businesses. So they're really doing a lot of different things, as well as helping with general cleanliness. And then we acknowledge that this is just the beginning. The other thing that we did on that project is we have an advisory committee where we wrote terms of reference that essentially required us to create an advisory committee that was inherently diverse. So we didn't just go for the usual suspects of typically white-haired men who are prominent Calgarians and tend to have a stronger voice than others. So that committee ended up, it took us a while to form it. I would say it took like weeks rather than a couple of meetings because of that process, but it worked very well. And then when they're reviewing the document with us, we're hearing those different voices from different backgrounds. And it did lend a lot of richness, I think, to the design in the end, because we heard from those different voices. So yeah, that's what we've been doing on Stephen Avenue, and I want to keep doing that on all of our projects, frankly.
And to be fair, I stole I call it a pre-apology. So I'm completely fine with it being characterized as an apology, because I own very comfortably the fact that I'm going to screw things up from time to time and make mistakes. So I call it I pre-apologize for the completely unintentional, inadvertent things. I have to say, one of the things that is very different in our context in these conversations and than our American partners is the sense of willingness within our own communities to have conversations and to work together. There's a far less confrontational mentality to it. It's much more about, good job, that's a step, what's the next step? So I think we're we have the luxury of being able to progress at a pace that we can manage. I know one of the big conversations we're having nationally is whose basket. I call it the whose basket conversation. Is a lot of the things that we've identified and the external forces have identified that we need to work on. It's helping them and our own members to understand who owns that. I was just on a DEI session for CLARB in the US, who, for those that don't remember, they manage the layers. And the conversation we were having is a combination of identifying who can fix that, but also understanding that we have power and authority over those groups in some ways, and influence where we have the ability to influence how it's being fixed. So a really great example of that we were talking about was requirements at the universities to do certain things in certain ways and include certain content. And someone said, well, that's LAABs or LABs or whatever. And I said, yeah, but we accredit them. And LAAB is not its own entity that is not accountable to the industry. So we have the ability to influence them, to encourage them to change their criteria so that when they're evaluating programs, and I mean, AALA, we accredit NATE. And I've already had conversations with Jennifer to talk about, you need to be ready the next time. We're going to start to ask some questions about larger cultural landscapes and diverse speakers, and how are you integrating that information into the classroom. And luckily, of course, Jen being Jen, she's like, oh my God, we're doing so many amazing things and we can't wait to tell you about them, which is what I expected the response was. But it's a great example where it's not, we actually control that, but we also control LAB in one way or another in some of those conversations. And in the US, they're having them already. They're already on it. So it's about identifying who's the right person and directing those energies the right way to support schools so that they know. I mean, I'm sure UC would say this, Nate will say it for sure. If we mandate certain things, it helps strengthen the case for what they want to do anyway. They want to do these things. And if we come in externally and say, this is essential to your accreditation, it adds another stick to that fire to support them with administration to make those changes.
So Todd, just you kind of spurred a thought here. In my, I don't know who knows this, but I have my Texas stamp, and one of the requirements in the continuing education is having to do with sustainability and a health and wellness component. And you have to sign off on that you've actually done a training seminar or whatever or on that. So, I mean, that could be something that we incorporate in our PDUs, is that you have to do a hour session of diversity. There's so many associations right now, like ESLA that offer so many different webinars that talk about exactly these things. So I don't think it'd be very hard to get that one credit, but I don't know, something like that. That is part of our training that you have to do once a year. I don't know, something to think about.
I will tell Julie, though, that you held her up as an example. Sorry, Julie Hildebrandt is a colleague of mine who I've worked with closely for the past several years. She runs the Texas board. So anytime, I will definitely let her know that Maggie threw her under the bus and said, that she was very unhappy that she had to do this DEI training to maintain her license. She'll love that. She'll think it's funny. It'll be very good. Yeah. But no, I do. I love that. And that's the sort of stuff that I think the conversations we need to be having is who do we influence and how do we support them? Like CSLA is doing some amazing things. Ina from OLA has been in the room the whole morning. I think Ingrid's probably around somewhere too. They're all doing this great work. And so a lot of it's supporting each other and having those conversations to figure out how do we go together, because what BC and Ontario and Alberta and Manitoba need to do, we all need to do it. So if we can work together and collaborate, we will. But part of it too is us working with our other external partners and supporting them. I mean, UC is a great example. If they need us to push for some stuff to help them build the case internally that they should make those are things we can do. And that's really, to me, the important part of the session. And we're starting to get there. As I'm starting to, like, I've got notes now of, okay, we need to talk about diversity on the PDU system. We need to look at a speaker series. Like, I'm starting to build those. So I love the fact that we're getting really practical and starting to drill into things we can touch and tactile. I do want to draw back to this conversation though around demographics and how do we collect that information so we can describe the industry. Do we need to collect that information? We sort of touched on it and then we veered off, and I want to draw us back to that conversation to see if there's a clear landing spot. I can tell the other two sessions have dropped off because we've picked up about 15 new people that missed all the really fun statistical data I spent an hour on. So hopefully they'll read it on their own later. But thoughts around data collection or other things we should be doing, actual boots on the ground stuff that we can operationalize and start to make some change. Do we need a DEI series? Go ahead, Grace.
Can we just collect the data? And if people don't want to, they just hit prefer not to specify.
Oh, you always include a prefer not to answer option.
Yeah. I
think
find
we should. Oh, I was just going to say, I think it would be helpful to have the data, but I think we should do it anonymously rather than with like our registration. Like, I think that people will be less likely to hit prefer not to respond if we did it anonymously. And it doesn't have to be a long, extensive survey. It can just be like a few. It would at least give us a starting point.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have to look back. I think I know who the Alberta respondents are. I think I have that. I should be able to pull some of that from the existing data set, but it may be something we have to collect on a more. Sometimes once you use the data, once people see how you're going to use it, they're more likely to give you the data in future data collections when it's a recurring.
Totally. Yeah.
Yep. We've picked up some board members and some others. Are there other questions or thoughts? Or if you came late and you're afraid you're going to say something we've already said, that's okay. So put it out there. I mean, half the board's in the room now, so it's a good time. We've got several past presidents in the room. I can see other questions, thoughts, ideas. Are we burnt out?
Sorry, Todd. I see that Michelle Legault tried probably on the public session chat to pose a question. Do we have a sense of how these numbers compare to the national population statistics? But I don't know if she can hear us, if she's still...
She's definitely still in the room, so she can hear. I don't know how our numbers compare to Stats Canada data. We'll definitely have to look into that. I would think the problem is the choose not to response in the data set. They skew a lot of things. When you do Stats Canada, there's not really a lot of prefer not to answers. If they ask you what race you are, you pretty much have to pick one. You might get an other, but yeah, they're not big on prefer not to answer. So it's tough to compare to stats. But I mean, for example, we know the gay population is typically 10% of the population on spectrum, and our data is only about 3%. So that's probably, we probably have an undersampling there, unless, because we certainly, based on my experience coast to coast to coast, we don't have an undersampling of gay people in the industry. I can name more than that percentage in the Alberta data set. So for sure we've undersampled there, just based on my personal experience. But Michelle, is your sound working?
Am I working now?
Yes, you're working now.
Thank you. Sorry about that, everybody. I put headphones on. It seems to have made all the difference. So, well, thanks, Todd, for this great session. You know, we were talking about sort of how to do this nationally and with all the component associations. And one of the things we're talking about doing, many of us actually hearing at the CSLA board meetings over the past 2 days in Appala, in Manitoba, you know, Alberta, everywhere, and Ontario. We all want to move to an action plan. And one of the things that we're thinking of doing with Ontario is pooling some of our resources because we are all, you know, hoping to hire a consultant to help us with this. So we've all put together task forces and groups, working groups who are interested in this subject. And the idea of having sort of an outside participation, outside consultant to bring some fresh eyes on this, we think would be really helpful. So we were talking about hiring a consultant who could help us put together what would be action plans on the national level and on the provincial, regional, or territorial level that would complement each other, so that we're not, you know, constantly reinventing the wheel and stepping on each other's toes, but we all have areas that we can work together and work independently, depending on, you know, the type of organization. And understanding too that across Canada, you know, we have some components with well over 1,000 members, and we have some components with about 5 members. So everybody's going to be able to do, you know, to do as much or as little as they can within their own context. So I just wanted to put that out there. That's some of the next steps we'll be taking in the coming months, nationally and provincially with this work. Lots of support for this work, lots of interest, and lots of enthusiasm. We've just finalized the members of our task force. We've got that information with a bunch of resources up on our website too. So it's been great listening to the conversation and all the ideas. I'm hearing a lot of common themes, and so it sounds like we're a lot on the same page, and you know, in terms of what we need and what we're looking for and what would be helpful for this. So thanks for this great session.
Thank you. We've been at it for 90 minutes, which is about the human capacity for functional anything. So unless there's any final burning thoughts people want to throw on the board or up in the chat window, questions the many board members who stumbled in from the other sessions wanted to pose to the group while we've got 40 of you in a room, I'm going to open it up for kind of one last round, and then I'm going to give you 20, 30 minutes to actually regroup, have some lunch maybe for some of you that have been back. Some of you I've seen back to back to back. So I'm wondering if you're, you know, you're on a diet and you're just not eating or need a coffee. And then obviously from here, we're going to shift in about at 3 o'clock sharp to the actual formal AGM and business meeting, followed by the awards ceremony. So final thoughts, final things people have been saving up to say, last comments.
Hey Todd, it is Caitlin here. I'm not sure if you guys discussed this or not. I jumped in late, but one of the recent things that we've had kind of an issue with on one of our projects is that we want to propose an all-inclusive campground loop and playground that kind of corresponds in this campground that we're designing. And we want to kind of show the client some data about folks living with disabilities and stats for, I know there was one section at the ARPA that kind of discussed this, that there's only, I want to say 2 playgrounds in all of Alberta that are designed specifically for like all ability playgrounds. And we're kind of hoping to propose that, and there isn't actually that much data out there for us to like support proposing this with a client. So I think that would be like another great addition to kind of showcase how many people like living throughout Canada or Alberta are living with disabilities and what services there are out there for recreation for them as well.
Yeah, there used to be a group at ARPA that actually focused entirely on that, and then they spun off, and I don't know if they've spun back in again, but I definitely think there should be some data, but I'm not so shocked that it's hard to find. And the funny part with disability, sorry, I worked in the sector for the last 8 years. What's good, what's accessible for one disability is inaccessible for others. It's tough to build something that fits all all things. I mean, I'll use an aquatics example for you. There's the regular temperatures you find a pool at, and then if you go a few degrees too warm, which is great for XYZ, like certain temperatures are better for people with epilepsy, and certain temperatures can cause seizures in that same group. And so, however, when you invert that, you know, those alternating temperatures are better for different disabilities. So some, like if you look at the ACT Center in Edmonton as an example, they have all these different systems, but they clearly say, these are the groups that this is going to work for, and these are the groups that shouldn't go in here. So it's a fascinating conversation once we talk about inclusive design, because what's good for a wheelchair can be bad for crutches, as an example. But I think that's a great, I mean, we've kind of really, my closing thought on this, and it's interesting, it's within the data, we've talked about ageism, we've talked about sexism, we've talked about some LGBTQ stuff, we've talked about people of color, we've talked about indigenous populations, we've wrapped up with physical ability. So there's a lot of spectrums of EDI where we may have to pick some and focus. Based on the data set we got, for sure, gender is going to be a big one, surprisingly big. But I do think there's other areas as well. And I want to thank everyone for their open and frank participation. You know what, even those of you that didn't say anything sat here and listened and took that information in for 90 minutes, which is pretty impressive. Hopefully, one of the things, especially from this group, because you clearly have some interest, I'm looking forward to some feedback on our keynote this morning. Gobinder, we have his recording for 30 days and then we have to destroy it. So if there's someone in your workplace who needs to see that video, you think will add value, please get them in there quick on Monday, because we can only hold that data for so long. But other than that, I want to thank you all for your participation and your engagement. If any of you, one of my key messages this weekend is we need more volunteers on these issues. So if this is an area of passion for you, make no mistake, this is recorded. So those of you who suggested things, I'll be reaching out to put you on committees to support us in operationalizing them. So just don't be shocked when that happens. But I do, if this is an area of interest or passion, or any one of the ideas that have hit the wall today you think is something you'd like to work on, please get back to me this weekend or Monday, and I will connect you with the board member who's leading those types of initiatives. And definitely, let's continue the conversation. As my Black Lives Matter stuff said, we're going to get stuff wrong, but we're going to try to do better, and we're coming at it from a place of improving things. So, and I know Ina is in the room, Michelle's in the room, we're working nationally on this as a team, and we're collaborating and supporting each other and leveraging. So when we do one thing, someone else does something else. So it's definitely a coast to coast to coast conversation. So thank you all for your participation and your engagement. Have a great sort of 20 minutes, and we'll see you back in the room for the AGM. If you could please, landscape architects, please log into the full version of Zoom. Do not watch through FeedLoop, because you're not going to be able to vote. Those of you who don't need to vote because you're not full landscape architects, please feel free to watch through FeedLoop. So our polls are mostly the LAs. Other than that, we'll see you back in about 20 minutes. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Good job, Todd. Thanks.